And we should be live. Hello, fellas. As always, we will be doing the regular thing. I'm going to have the Riot server open, riot.renaissancemen.xyz, and if you sign up and you make an account on this service, I will be reading the chat, the voice to text as people send in questions. Now, to start things up, let's talk about the painting in the background. It is called The Triumph of the Guillotine by Nicolas Antoine Tournay. Now, it isn't certain if it was painted by Tournay, but it would indicate from the style that it was. They're merely inferring it when they found it. It's a very... I don't know if you can see the entire thing. I know that I've set the settings so that you can't see the whole painting, but it sums up the French Revolution pretty well. The triumph of the guillotine, the hell that revolution actually causes. And unfortunately, in our society... Actually, I'll move this slightly just so you can see the rest. Is there much left? No, I didn't think there was. And up here we have some of the revolutionary poets. But as we're often not taught at school, these revolutions are very brutal. We often can't avoid the brutality of the Russian Revolution when it's taught in schools, because it was one of the defining features, right? It had a countrywide civil war follow after the initial, well, not the February Revolution, but the October Revolution. Whereas with France, this isn't really taught. There's some superficial stuff about the terror taught, but nothing really massively in detail about it. But in fact, it's one of the most important historical events in human history, and it's shameful how little it's taught. Now, how does this pertain to communism? Well, it's because, ideologically speaking, the French Revolution precedes communism. The égalité, fraternité, and liberté of the French Revolution. I'm not even going to attempt the French pronunciations. These ideas fed into the 19th century intellectuals, which created Marxism, which created communism, of course, as we know it. Now, Marx himself was not actually a Marxist. He was a human being who produced works that inspired a movement. But he did produce one of the most interesting strains of human intellectual thought of all time. And a very, very dangerous one as well, as I'm sure I don't need to tell the conservatives in the audience. However, it's often not connected enough to the French Revolution. For example, you hear people like Jordan Peterson say, well, if we just remained liberal, we wouldn't have all of this horrific stuff. Right? He forgets that in the wars of the coalitions against France, and during the Napoleonic Wars, that over 1 million people were killed. He forgets that in the 1848 liberal revolutions in France and Germany, and to a lesser extent in Britain, also Austria was quite a big case, hundreds of thousands of people were killed. And I want to start this stream off by saying this, because there's far too many people who believe that we can just go back to this égalité, fraternité, liberté paradigm and then solve the problem of Marxism. No, one is a successor to the other. From Rousseau and from the French Revolution came Hegel, came Feuerbach, came the young Hegelians, including Marx, and from there we get Engels and Lenin. Well, Engels was with Marx. You know what I mean. You get the inheritance going down there, and then you get more contemporary important thinkers like Theodor Adorno and Anton Gramsci. I just want to set that up, because you'll see a lot of parallels with the French Revolution in these points. Thanks for telling me that, Kate Chilius, about the notification. I'm not surprised, I must say. But here's what we're going to be covering today, and I'm not going to share the screen, because there's really no sense in me sharing the screen here. And that is something that was published in 1958 by a CIA agent called Cléon Skousen in his book The Naked Communist. Now, Cléon Skousen of course, being in the intelligence services, had access to many primary sources from the Russians. And he wrote a book called The Naked Communist. Now, this was picked up by a congressman in the US in 1963 called Albert Herong Jr. And he put these goals from his book, from Clayon's book, into the congressional records. And this includes 45 communist goals that were established for the United States. Now, bear in mind, this of course was written in 1958, and this bore in mind the geopolitical situation before the Cuban Missile Crisis and just as the Cold War was beginning in earnest. But I was reading through them, and I couldn't help but notice how similar they are to how American society has changed. And a lot of this is largely inertia. Like, as much as we may want to point to Yuri Bezmenov and point to Soviet subversion and suggest that this may be the reason why the West has suffered such a moral decline, it's much more than that, and it's been going on for much longer, of course, which is why I linked the French Revolution to this. But it is an indication that it's not purely some organic movement that happened in the 1960s and subsequently. There was, as well as the civilizational inertia of the West pulling us back down, it was also deliberate infiltrators from the Eastern Bloc and a fifth column. Now, here is how the stream is going to work. I'm going to go through each of the goals relatively briefly, unless I think that they're really important and something that really needs to be made light of, and perhaps explain some of the history of why these particular things were easy to achieve, or at least in my view. But we'll also be answering questions along the way, because I'm sure when you hear these, when you hear how different and how varied and how typically and seemingly un-Marxist, or at least how un-Marxist the establishment tells us these things are, yeah, I think you'll find it very interesting. So we'll begin with the first couple, because a few of these are pretty obvious from a geopolitical standpoint with the USSR in 1958. 1. US acceptance of coexistence as the only alternative to atomic war. So basically, in 1958, this would have probably involved pulling US advisors out of Vietnam. I suppose Africa hadn't been properly decolonized yet. It would have involved a much more isolationist United States, one that wasn't willing to push, well, I suppose you'd call it capitalism, or whatever the American ideology even is. I suppose you'd call it greedy materialism, as opposed to starving materialism, throughout the world, in opposition to Marxism. 2. US willingness to capitulate in preference to engaging in atomic war. Now, obviously this sounds reasonable, but in 1958, I'm pretty sure, now it says on the page that I'm reading off, edberry.com, that this was published in 1963, so these may have been modified. There are other pages where the editions of The Naked Communist have been reiterated over time. In fact, the most recent publication was 2014. But mutually assured destruction wasn't really so understood as it is now back then. You didn't have movies like The Day After or Threads. You hadn't even had the Cuban Missile Crisis at that point. So it wasn't quite so widely understood that it was... Well, it wasn't quite as burned into the collective memory as something that could end the world. I'm sure that people knew. But at the same time, being willing to capitulate in preference to engaging in atomic war would give the USSR free rein in Europe, effectively. Because the ground forces in the 1950s in Europe for the Soviets were far superior to the European ones, or the Western capitalist ones, as well, although that wasn't the case with air power. But still. It would have given a profound advantage to the Soviets in Europe. Number 3. Now, this sounds very interesting. Develop the illusionment that total disarmament by the United States would be a demonstration of moral strength. Now, this is something that is, of course, still being pushed today. And it's somewhat helped by religious movements. Particularly certain fringe Protestant ones, because they believe, pacifism is what Christ would have wanted. Right? And such things, which are, of course, nonsense. But, nonetheless, there are people who continue to believe them. Some people believe that the true strength is just being completely passive. And I suspect very strongly that this came out of the culture that was developed by these communists. Let me put it this way. If you look into it, you'll find that Senator McCarthy was far from insane. In fact, you'd had communist circles in California since the 1910s. Of course, if you guys have questions, stick them in the Riot chat preferably. Otherwise, stick them in the YouTube chat. I'll read both. Number 4. Permit free trade between all nations regardless of communist affiliation and regardless of whether or not items could be used for war. This, of course, hasn't happened because the Warsaw Pact no longer exists. Neither does the USSR. And it didn't really happen in the 1960s and 70s either, as far as I understand. They certainly weren't giving over military technology. Number 5. Extension of long-term loans to Russia and Soviet satellites. Now, this was important. Increasingly as time went on, I'm not sure about the 1950s, but certainly by the 1980s, 50% of the USSR's GDP was invested in the military. So, there wasn't so much of an economy there to really back it up, right? It's very difficult. In comparison, around the same time, the US was spending 1 to 2% of its GDP on its military. So you can see the misbalance there. If there's 25-fold difference. So, of course, the Soviets needed money. And also, the fact that the Russians would have US loans would also make it less plausible that the US would attack the USSR because, well, they're never going to get the money back on the loan if they attack. Number 6. Provide American aid to all nations regardless of communist domination. Now, we have largely seen this across the world. America just seems to give aid to almost everyone, including people who turn into their enemies. It's sometimes rather sad. There isn't... I think this is because of the whole world police thing and trying to buy power, but nonetheless, it's still not a good idea to put military technology in rather close proximity to ISIS or the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, for that matter. Although, of course, these communists would not have wanted the Mujahideen to have acquired Stinger missiles to take out their helicopters and planes in Afghanistan. Let's check the questions. Charlie Adams asks, is it right for the UK to give 3 million Hong Kong people British citizenship? No. That's basically my opinion. I think it's pie in the sky. Now, this is an interesting one. This is one that they did achieve in the 1970s. Grant recognition of Red China. Admission of Red China to the UN. Now, this began in the early 1970s under Nixon. There was the agreement wherein Maoist China and the US would trade. And then Jimmy Carter formally recognised them later on in the decade. So that did happen. Number 8. Set up East and West Germany as separate states in spite of Khrushchev's promise in 1955 to settle the German question by free elections under supervision of the UN. Well, you see, the Berlin Wall, I think, was built in 1955. Or it may have even been 1960. But yeah, that obviously didn't happen until 1989. Or that obviously didn't end even until 1989. Number 9. Prolong the conferences to ban atomic tests because the United States has agreed to suspend tests as long as negotiations are in progress. Well, yeah, of course, you don't want your enemy developing better nuclear capacity than you. Number 10, allow all Soviet satellites individual representation in the UN. So, for those who don't know what Soviet satellites are, they're not the things in the sky that provide you with television. They are puppet states. So, in 1958, this would have been places like Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary. There would have been Romania, Bulgaria. Not Yugoslavia, though. Yugoslavia, actually, if you ever get a chance to read into Yugoslavia and Tito, you'll find a very interesting relationship between Tito and Stalin. Suffice to say, there was one nut that Stalin couldn't crack, and that was Tito. This eventually happened, but of course, the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. Number 11. Promote the UN as the only hope for mankind. If its charter is rewritten, demand it be set up as a one-world government with its own independent armed forces. Some Soviet leaders, or some communist leaders, believe the world can be taken over as easily by the UN as by Moscow. Sometimes these two centres compete with each other, as they are now doing in the Congo. This was, of course, written in This is actually a 1963 updated version, so at that point, the Congo had just become independent from Belgium. There's also other interesting stories about UN peacekeeping forces in the Congo. For example, there was a siege where an Irish battalion in the UN were besieged by something like 10,000 Katangan militiamen, and they held out against them. This is just evidence of... This is an updated version to cover the decolonization, because the decolonization had begun in the early 60s. Britain left Kenya. Belgium, of course, left not Colombia, the Congo in both its incarnations. You had Portugal holding on very, very slightly to Angola and to Mozambique, and you had France leaving what is now known as Burkina Faso, what was known as the Republic of the Upper Volta, Senegal, and there was... I can't remember if the war in Algeria had ended at that point. But either way, you're dealing with the final decolonization of Africa at this point. But yeah, the UN, of course, by virtue of being established pretty much by all nations, is going to be very hard to boycott, whereas, of course, Moscow can be. So I suppose if the Soviet Union failed, there's only one sort of unifying brotherhood of all nations that could be used. Number 12. Resist any attempt to outlaw the Communist Party. Yeah, the Communist Party existed in the US and continues to. Interesting one. Do away with all loyalty oaths. Now, I'm not sure if that's because they wanted to avoid prosecution, because undoubtedly they break their oaths because they don't believe in oaths, or if it was to undermine the presence of Christian culture in the legislature, because oaths are a distinctly Christian thing. They are viewed... They weren't really so much of a thing to the Enlightenment people, and also not as much to the pagans as it was to the Old Testament Israelites. I won't say Jews because that's technically incorrect. Continue giving Russia access to the US Patent Office. Now, apparently they already had that. I suppose that was something that should have been dealt with. Let's see if there's any questions. Magnus the Red said, would you consider a sort of tutorial video on how to access the right server and your other resources? Well, I can tell you right now. The link in the description that says renaissanceman.xyz, that has a link. If you click riot.renaissanceman.xyz and you have a browser, you will be able to use it. You just establish an account on the home server, which is the server that I've established, and then you do that and you click explore and find the voice to text channel. Okay. Let's see. Jesus said not to swear by earth or heaven, though. Not rashly, no. But oaths were still a thing. For example, holy orders. You swear an oath of chastity, obedience, and, in some cases, stability. And poverty as well, that's another one. So, but that's swearing on the evangelical councils. You're going to follow the evangelical councils through. I mean, if oaths were such a bad thing, they wouldn't be so present in the Old Testament. But the thing is that you don't swear them rashly. Okay, 15. Capture one or both of the political parties in the United States. Now, most people would immediately default to the Democrats are the ones that got done in. But really, the Republicans did in a certain sense as well, because they're only interested in economic policy. There's no real social conservatism there at all. And as we will discover later on in this list, the social conservatism would have been the thing that really resisted them. Also, neoconservatism has some strange Trotskyite lineage. Okay. 16. Use technical decisions of the court to weaken basic American institutions by claiming their activities violate civil rights. Huh. What, you mean like the police? I mean, I doubt they were thinking about the police in 1958. I think they'd have been stunned by their own success if they thought that they could convince a sizable chunk of the American people that the police were evil. But, you know, it does seem very interesting that they would use a very humanistic morality disconnected from any sort of first principle to undermine institutions that decidedly were built on a very flawed first principle, those being the principles of the American Republic's foundation, those deist Enlightenment values that reign not only in the US but also in France. Perhaps that's why the Conservatives like going on about the Constitution, because they realise that that's the only thing actually grounding the institutions that they want to run. Now, of course, you'd be smart to do this, but it doesn't matter if if you're a bigot. As far as I understand, Magnus, Safari works, Chrome works, and Firefox works. I've heard that Edge doesn't. But who uses Microsoft Edge, really? Right, let's continue. Here's one you guys will like. Get control of the schools. Use them as transmission belts for socialism and current communist propaganda. Soften the curriculum. Get control of teachers' associations. Put the party line in textbooks. Have we seen this? I think you'll find that in a certain sense we have. Soften the curriculum. There's no rigid right or wrong to a question. It's just your opinion, bro. It's just your opinion as long as you keep to what the textbooks say. Of course there's colonialism in films from the 1910s. Because, we've softened the curriculum. There's no connection between any sort of thought in the humanities and its correlation to reality anymore. Truth has been abolished. And that is what the softening the curriculum is. You can never give a wrong answer to a question in history. Well, unfortunately, yes you can. I remember decidedly being taught that by my history teacher, who I did indeed have a strong level of respect for. You can't give a wrong answer in the exam, but it turns out that you can. For example, it would be incorrect to assert that Marxism was a significant factor in the War of the Roses in Britain, because Marxism didn't exist. Sure, there may have been material motivations for the leaders in both the Yorkist and Lancastrian parties, but Marxism in itself didn't. And of course, it really helps to soften the curriculum, because then you get a lot of lower IQ people in the universities, and when you've got lower IQ people tend to have lower self-control and lower impulse control, so they're more likely to go nuts. Sounds like really good fuel for protests, if you ask me. Because you don't really you don't really see the maths professors going out and shouting and screaming about imagined grievances. And those tend to be the highest IQ professors in the university. Likewise, before maybe the 1940s, you didn't really have these huge student protests, because the people in the humanities still were pretty self-controlled. But if you've softened the curriculum, if you've completely stripped out the part that says, no, you're wrong, be quiet, first of all, you're letting people labour under delusions, and second of all, you're reducing their need for self-control, because, I can't possibly be wrong, why don't I just say it? Anyway, let's continue. 18. Gain control of all student newspapers. Yeah, there's a reason why I've never attempted to write for the student newspapers at my uni. 19. Use student riots to foment public protests against programs or organisations which are under communist attack. Fonk. Number 20. Infiltrate the press. Get control of book review assignments, editorial writing, policy-making positions. Wow, I wonder why all of the books that are coming out now are so completely devoid of any truth. I wonder why Jean-Paul Sartre is prized so much by modern philosophers. I wonder why we continue to follow this analytic school of philosophy where all you really do is exclude hypotheses that we can explore, and then you have the other side being continentals, which are almost entirely Marxists. Could this perhaps be due to the control of the publishing institutions, or indeed of academia? But no, that would be a conspiracy theory. Are you the son of Peter Hitchens? No, the son of Peter Hitchens does write for the Catholic Herald, but no, I'm not the son of Peter Hitchens. Although his book, The Abolition of Britain, does sound very, very similar to this. Let's see the riot. Is there anything on the riot? No. 21. Gain control of key positions in radio, TV, and motion pictures. To be honest, by 1958, a lot of Hollywood had already been dominated. That's what they won't tell you. Number 22. Continue discrediting American culture by degrading all forms of artistic expression. An American communist cell was told to, quote, eliminate all good sculpture from parks and buildings, substitute shapeless, awkward, and meaningless forms. Is that perhaps because the good, the true, and the beautiful points to God, and Marxism is innately atheistic? Is it perhaps that these statues might point to a time that is outside of the accounting of the ideology being pushed? Is it perhaps because the only place that people are entirely equal is in hell? Well, I'll leave that for you to judge. 23. Control art critics and directors of art museums. Our plan, quote, our plan is to promote ugliness, repulsive, meaningless art. Number 24. Eliminate all laws governing obscenity by calling them, quote, censorship, and a violation of free speech and free press. Well, if they could see, in fact, this is actually the next point, if they could see how widespread pornography is, if they could see just the amount of blasphemous books coming out, I think they would be. That's entirely exceeded their expectations. Number 25. Break down cultural standards of morality by promoting pornography and obscenity in books, magazines, motion pictures, radio, and TV. Well, good luck switching a television on without it being a near occasion of sin. And I'm going to take a very quick break, but we'll go into number 26. And bear in mind, this is this congressman, this Democratic congressman, who's quoting this, a Democrat, and he says, present homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as, quote, normal, natural, and healthy. I wonder why that might be. Well, I will be back in a moment, and we will explore the destruction of American culture to a much greater extent. Because, believe me, these first 25 points, they're only the beginning. And the next ones, I mean, they won't shock you, but it really does make you think. It really gets the noggin jogging. I'll be back in a sec. My apologies. Alright, let's see if there are any questions. Okay. Any questions, fellas? Let's see. Orthodox Marxism in the West post-Gramsci killed itself, ironically giving birth to a more brutal form of capitalism. That's why most modern, quote, Marxist movements are involved in social movements, not labour. Yeah. Yeah, Anton Gramsci is incredibly important. I should read him. But I've never gotten around to it. Time to completely forego secular entertainment, including television, video games, and comics, etc. I mean, I'm not sure that's even possible. I know that I don't watch television, really. I know that I try and avoid places where I know that I'm going to be fed subversive ideas, because, you know, the memory is the devil's plaything, right? Memory can be deliberately manipulated by people tempting you, and by things tempting you. So you don't want to give them the opportunity. This is a reason why we had the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, you know, the Index of Prohibited Books, so we could avoid this sort of thing. Franco Machado says, I would recommend reading Augusto del Noce. He goes into detail about how Marxist thought developed post-Gramsci and why, even though they have gained power, the vision of Marx has failed. Yeah. Okay, so let's continue. Yeah, George Washington actually makes an important point. The left was big before Marx. I misread that for a moment there. Okay, so the left-right paradigm actually comes from the National Convention of the French Revolution, which is another reason why the painting in the background, the triumph of the guillotine, is there. Now, those on the right were more in favour of a constitutional monarchy with Louis XVI before he got killed, or very briefly for Louis XVII, who was imprisoned. The left, the Jacobin party, you know, those people who were alongside people like Maximilien Robespierre, Jean-Baptiste, I can't remember his surname, maybe not Denis, you know, Herbertists, people like that. There was this really, really ugly guy whose name I cannot remember for the life of me, but he was really important as well. I mean, like, really hideously ugly. In fact, to the point where he was known for it. I'm not saying that to insult the fellow as well. He was legitimately really ugly. What was his name? Either way. Yeah, they were on the left, and then you had the more constitutional monarchy people on the right. Okay. And that's why we need to bring this back to the French Revolution. Because we talk in terms of left and right all the time. I do it. But this all originates from a paradigm that is anti-Christian. But let's continue. 27. Infiltrate the churches and replace revealed religion with, quote, social religion. Discredit the Bible and emphasize the need for intellectual maturity, which does not need a religious crutch, unquote. Now, of course, this kind of arrogance, the need for intellectual maturity that does not need a religious crutch, of course, only weakens people. Because if they believe that they are strong, independent men who don't need no Bible, they're going to be, of course, undermined by their passions and are much easier to control. And they know this. In fact, I suspect that that's one of the reasons why there was such a glut of really awful Bible translations like The Message. You also had this previously through things like the Schofield Bible. All of these little heresies planted in, or just straight absurdity, to draw people out of the faith. And also to make them easier to control, because the thing with heresies is that they deprive you of divine grace. At least when you're consciously in error. If you're consciously in error, you're a heretic. But error does it the same way, right? You can be a sincere Bible-believing Christian, as they would call it in the US, because you've got to remember at this point, the US was still largely Protestant. If you are in error on something, which of course Protestants are, you're going to have real problems in the spiritual life. And when you have real problems in the spiritual life, it's a lot easier to fall into sin. And when you are in sin, you are easy to control. Which these people know. Of course they don't use these phrases, but they do know that when you've got someone caught in a bad habit, they're easy to control. In fact, there was a canon lawyer who formed the Illuminati in Bavaria in the 1770s called Adam Weishaupt, who did this. He ran his secret society, I think it was a Freemasonic lodge, or something reminiscent of that, and he'd hear people's kind of quasi-confessions, and from that determine their sinful habits so they could control them. Now, likewise with Marxists, of course, they of course learnt from this, or at least the smart ones did, and so through implanting weaknesses in people through the school system, they become a lot easier to control. And of course, the most easy way to do this is sex, which is also why the scriptures are so harsh, or seemingly harsh to our modern ears on the subject, because being as passionate and strong as it is, it's very easy to control someone in the midst of that passion. Not to mention destroying families. Not Jean-Paul Marat. Marat, the one who was murdered in the bath, he's not the one I was thinking of. The guy who genocided Catholics in the Vendée. Jean-Baptiste. I want to see now. I'm gonna Google this because this is bugging me. Vendée. There we go. Yeah, Jean-Baptiste Carrier. Yeah, or Jean-Baptiste Carrier, if I'm butchering the French. I don't speak French. So, that's the guy. Okay, let's check the questions. Lafayette started a radical republic and was later thrown out of France for being too right-wing. Yeah, Lafayette was in favour of a constitutional monarchy, if I remember correctly. How do we combat these infiltrations? Well, I don't know, but we're going to go through this list, and we might be able to come up with something in the chat. Okay. 28. Eliminate prayer or any phase of religious expression in the schools on the ground that it violates the principle of separation of church and state. Huh. Well, a lot of people will cite George Washington during the Barbary War, where he said that the US was not founded on Christian principles, which it wasn't. But later on there was a court decision, a Supreme Court decision in 1892 that defined the US as a Christian country. So regardless of what the state papers may have said, and regardless of the kind of cringy things that some of the founders did, like Jefferson removing all of the miracles from the Bible, I don't know why he spent his time doing that. America certainly did become a Christian country, even if the founders didn't think it was. And so you have people exploiting this to remove the religiosity, which of course weakens the revealed religion. Number 29. Discredit the American Constitution by calling it inadequate, old-fashioned, out of step with modern needs, and a hindrance to cooperation between nations on a worldwide basis. Well, I don't necessarily disagree with the statement that it's inadequate. I mean, it's a human document. Of course it's going to be inadequate. But that's, of course, not the point. Because when you undermine the foundation of a country's civil laws, it's a lot easier to play around. And I can't tell you what US law is like, but I know that British law is at such a point, because of the lawyers, that there's no real continuation with common law as it would have been seen 100 years ago. Because of the being undermined by these sorts of people, this idea that somehow common law is old-fashioned, right? So, for example, if you had taken someone like John Locke, who had of course, largely created modern British common law through his treatises on government, and you told him about, say, obscenity laws, and how these violated freedom of speech, he'd have laughed you out of the room, because he'd have said, well, freedom is just the absence of arbitrary control, and there's no arbitrariness with reducing obscenity, because obscenity objectively harms the common good. But if you consider natural law and common law to be old-fashioned, and then, as we saw earlier, call it bigoted, then it becomes a lot more socially difficult for someone to defend against that kind of change, which of course makes you better able to control things. Number 30. Discredit the American Founding Fathers. Present them as selfish aristocrats who had no concern for the, quote, common man. Yes. This is, of course, what's happened. They're trying to tear down their statues. Let's check if there are any questions. We'll check the riot. Whoops, I'm tabbing wrong. Okay. Why do liberals think that Jesus would be okay with a thing I won't mention because he didn't mention it? Well, I think that people in the past generally, perhaps before about 1900, would have found the concept of identifying with your thoughts against the 6th and 9th commandment to be a very strange thing. In fact, gender was a grammatical concept until, say, Alfred Kinsey got a hold of it. It's all very strange, and I think Jesus would have probably said something along the lines of "Don't violate the 9th commandment, regardless of whatever temptation pops into your head, be they of any form." So, beats me. I mean, I think I've seen enough about Jesus somehow being killed by the police to know that these people have absolutely no reverence whatsoever for their king and God, and so they should just be discounted entirely. If they cannot have reverence for the most important figure in human history, bar none, I don't care if you're an atheist or a Christian or a Muslim, right? You can at least concede that Jesus is at least one of the most important figures in history. If you can't show basic reverence and decide to co-opt this figure, this true God and true man, for the end of a political purpose, well, I mean, what does that say about the person? Let's see the next part. Okay, let's continue. Belittle all forms of American culture and discourage the teaching of American history on the ground that it was only a minor part of the, quote, big picture. Give more emphasis to Russian history since the communists took over. Well, I mean, I wish that they'd given more emphasis to Russian history, but really they just stopped teaching history. Now, I loved history in school in the UK because it seems to be very different from the US. Because in the US, it seems like the history APs are basically just short-form questions and multiple choice. In Britain, you have to actually read. You have to read a lot of books for higher level history qualifications. Now, granted, most people really lack imagination, and so they'll only read books written after about 1950. But if you're someone who wants to, someone who has the prerequisite curiosity, you can very easily go and find history books from the 19th century. And I did this with the French Revolution, and I also did it with the later Tudor era. And one thing you'll find very, very quickly is that the history books of the 19th century are just simply superior. I mean, we may have more academics running around institutions than we did in the 19th century, but I'm sorry, the history books are just simply superior. They're better detailed. They seem more in connection with the real world. There's less platitudinous language. They don't really mess around, though. That's not to say that they aren't biased. The prime example would be somebody like Edward Gibbon, who was not a very good historian, particularly in his view on Christianity. It was influenced by these Enlightenment philosophers who were naturally very antithetical to Christianity in their views. Let's see. Questions. Why won't you answer my question? Because I'm not about to read something out that's going to get this flagged. There's your answer. Okay. Here we go. Let's continue. Number 32. Support any socialist movement to give centralized control over any part of the culture, education, social agencies, welfare programs, mental health clinics, etc. That last one will be important. Number 33. Eliminate all laws or procedures which interfere with the operation of communist apparatus. Duh. Number 34. Eliminate the House Committee on Un-American Activities. I wasn't even aware that something like that exists. I'm actually kind of curious to see when they shut it down. I bet it was like the 60s or 70s. So it's founded in 1938. And it was disestablished in 1975 by the looks of it. Yeah, formally terminated on January the 14th, 1975. So, just inside of Gerald Ford's presidency, I think. Because it goes Nixon, Ford, then Carter, if I remember correctly. Number 35. Discredit and eventually dismantle the FBI. Or infiltrate it. We still have the FBI. It may have resisted. I don't know. But, I don't know. I think the fact that the schools have been controlled for so long would tell me that it probably didn't need to be dismantled. Infiltrate and gain control of more unions. I assume they mean trade unions. The most recent casualty in this, or avoidance in this, is the police. The reason they're trying to abolish the police is because the police unions are the only right-wing unions really left. And they want to replace them with private security, because they cannot infiltrate it. Not to mention the fact that the private security has a lot less liability on the local governments, right? Because if they're private, it's not the government's problem. They're just paying them as contractors. Number 37. Infiltrate and gain control of big business. Well, I'm not sure they have. Because we see all of this signalling from the businesses, but they're willing to behave in the exact opposite way in other places like China, which tells me they're not really ideological. Now, of course, some are, and I think the perfect example of these are the tech companies. These are highly ideological operations, and I think that's largely due to the sorts of people that computer science attracts. People who are very savantish and I'll say it. Have a very unsophisticated view of humanities. But aside from that, I'm not sure that's actually happened. Let's see. Okay. 19th century sources can come to the wrong conclusions and be incorrect. Yeah, of course, because more sources are revealed nowadays that were available back then. Yeah, that is correct. Right, there are more sources available now, but the quality of the people is worse. Quite frankly, right? Like the English historians may well have been more Protestant, right? But they were actually taught to properly read, to properly write, and were willing to not stare at a screen all day. They were more virtuous people, and it shows. You can tell from their writing that they were just simply better educated, right? This is like, I seem to remember someone saying, I won't name who, but a very prominent writer in internet circles, he said, the modern man is more intelligent than Aristotle and Aquinas because they have the internet, which is just really stupid. Like, just because you have access to more information doesn't mean that you're more liable to come to a correct conclusion, because that's ultimately what intelligence is. Intelligence is the ability to discern between good and bad in a particular situation. And people are just decidedly not very able to do that. Sometimes they use too much information, and sometimes they're made so arrogant by other factors that they just blind themselves. There's also, of course, the issue of unchastity, which I think I've gone on enough about on this channel. Oh, that was McCarthy's committee. Oh, cool. Let's continue. Number 38. Transfer some of the powers of arrest from the police to social agencies. Treat all behavioural problems as psychiatric disorders, which no one but psychiatrists can understand or treat. Now, I mean, I have a lot of problems with the mental health establishment, and I suspect this is one of them. Right, like everything has become a disorder nowadays, something that can only be solved with drugs or by psychiatrists, and it's very interesting that they would have observed this in the late 1950s, because I don't think it was as present then, that culture, although it was of course bubbling up through the psychologists and cognitive behavioural therapists that were beginning to come up in academia. Right, you have, of course, cognitive scientists who just assumed that the mind was entirely material. I'm thinking of Donald Hebb, especially, in this case, the Organisation of Behaviour. You have these people who assume that everything is material, so of course, if there are any mental problems, then it's obviously a psychiatric disorder which can only be altered by people who know what pills to pop. There's no such thing as a soul, there's no such thing as virtue, so, parents can't really teach their children how to behave well. They have to have their Xanax or whatever, which of course undermines the family, which we'll get onto in a moment. Number 39. Dominate the psychiatric profession and use mental health laws as a means of gaining coercive control over those who oppose communist goals. I can't possibly imagine places where this could be a problem. There's one very very large area that I don't think it's very prudent to mention on stream, but suffice to say, the perception of which is almost omnipresent in modern society and has been rendered to a point of such meaninglessness that it's essentially used as an excuse to demolish any relationship whatsoever. Now, in previous times, this had a concrete definition, and both the church and the state dealt with it. However, due, I suspect, to this, I don't know, of course, that definition has become so flexible and so meaningless that it can be applied at any emotional whim. Number 40. Discredit the family as an institution. Encourage promiscuity and easy divorce. Well, you've seen that, haven't you? Let's see the questions again. What do you think about an idea like what? Sorry, what Catholic control zones? Yeah, just read the Benedict option. That's been around for years. Okay, let's continue. Emphasize the need to raise children away from negative influence of parents. Attribute prejudices, mental blocks, and the the slowing of children. I won't say the particular word because it has a different connotation nowadays. The slowing of children to suppressive influence of parents. Well, I'm pretty sure that had already happened. That was already happening in the 60s. And it's certainly around now. Number 42. Create the impression that violence and insurrection are legitimate aspects of the American tradition. After all, you know, there was the Revolutionary War. You're just like, you're just winning the Battle of Saratoga, aren't you there, Berkeley students? The students and special interest groups should rise up and use, quote, united force to solve economic, political and social problems. This happened, actually, this was published in Congress in 1963, and of course was written in 1958. But this was already a problem by 1968. And it continued throughout the 70s. Groups like the Weathermen. And of course we're seeing these now as well in the form of the Bureau of Light Motor Vehicles. Number 43. Overthrow all colonial governments before native populations are ready to self-govern. Well, we saw that in the 60s. Number 44. Internationalize the Panama Canal. That's happened. As far as I know, you can pretty much just go through there regardless of what country you're from. Now, of course, this is less of a problem now that the Soviet bloc doesn't exist. And I have no idea when it actually happened. But it still weakens American influence. Number 45. Repeal the Connolly Reservation so the United States cannot prevent the World Court from seizing jurisdiction over domestic problems. Give the World Court jurisdiction over nations and individuals alike. I don't actually think this has happened. It may well have, though. Let me have a look. The Connolly Reservations, it doesn't appear to have been appealed. But still, I mean, the whole world policing thing was ultimately taken over by the American government anyway. Okay, so that's the list. If you guys want to just ask questions, whether through the riots or through other servers or anything, go ahead. I can already see a few here. We're going to enter a kind of Q&A session here for the next 10 minutes. So if you guys have questions, now would be the time to post them. Right. So let's have a look first. What do you think about Locke and Voltaire? Well, Locke didn't believe in giving full civil rights to Catholics. His view in the treatises on government is fundamentally founded on the principles found in the Institutes of Christian Religion by John Calvin. Now, of course, Calvin is probably the heretic. He is the arch heretic in the Protestant movement, more so than Luther, because Luther still sustained certain things like the privileged position of Mary is the example that springs to mind. He still believed that God was in some way present in the Eucharist, granted in a rather silly way, but still. Calvin didn't. Calvin believed that the Eucharist was essentially a symbol, and that's it. Now, let's disregard what symbolic meaning would have meant in a patristic sense, which would have been a lot more literal. He believed it was just bread, bro. Which was cringe. And of course, there was also modifications to the view of virtue, right? From the Protestants generally. For example, I recall hearing about Bonaventure's spiritual works being read by Luther, and because Luther couldn't get them to work in a linear sense, he just threw them away, which is really, really silly. And of course, this goes through on ethics, and Locke picked up on this. As for Voltaire, he was driven by the classics, classical education, and dumped Christianity very early on. And so he was driven by this kind of republican ideal that people like Cicero had and Sallust and people like that. Now, he was less egregious than someone like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but he was still bad. Now, these men, in themselves, their own moral lives, I don't know. I have a suspicion that their views on natural law were influenced a lot by their sinful inclinations, because both rejected grace in a very obvious sense, particularly Voltaire. I think Voltaire even wrote anti-Catholic tracts. But, you know, they... How do I put this? Yeah, basically, like, I don't know for certain. I don't know their own minds. So I hope they're saved. Is this why Peter Hitchens doesn't believe in ADHD? I don't know. I do think that a lot of the autism diagnoses and stuff are used for this sort of thing, right? Because if you have someone who's autistic, right, you don't have to, or you can't enforce behaviour on them because, you know, they've got mental disorder, right? That would be unjust. And frankly, I refuse to believe that 10% of the population is autistic. Like non-recoverably autistic. Maybe 1 or 2%, right? But most of these people are just a little strange, and that's fine. You know, there are people who've got eccentricities. That doesn't make someone disordered. Eccentricities in themselves aren't disorders in themselves, although legitimate mental illnesses and physical ailments are, of course. But eccentricities are kind of outside of the diminishment of particular human faculties, which is where disability comes from, right? If you have a disabled sense of, say, sight, right, you'd be visually impaired. But just I don't know, maybe not having as much social awareness as everyone else, right? Unless it's to an extreme degree, can you really call that disordered? As much as just being different? I bet that a lot of kids having that diagnosis forced on them as young children, I can imagine that's influenced them quite a lot if they haven't been able to look and realise a lot of the time these people were full of it. Should women be allowed in the workforce? I suppose so. It really depends on the economic situation of the family. How can we wrest control of the institutions of power from the left? Frankly, I think it's... you build your own. Ori, sorry, the Discord invite isn't working. Yeah, just click the riot link on the website, renaissancemen.xyz. You can find that link in the description. Panama Canal was nationalised under Carter. Internationalised under Carter. It was under Carter. Oh, funny that. Of course, a lot of these things were Carter. Let's have a look. Your thoughts on the corruption of Christianity. When did it begin? I would say I would say, you know, there was this geezer called Adam, and he had a wife called Eve, and they found this really nice fruit, and they decided that they were above God's rules, and ate of that fruit, and that was when the corruption of Christianity happened. Because that was the first time anyone lost their state of grace. In fact, in the Jewish tradition, because of this, we hear that Adam died of 40 diseases at once. You cannot just point to a particular time and say that's where the decline is, because human beings are human beings, right? Like, you see, you perceive decline. Because you see things like, I don't know, social breakdown occurring. But you don't see the fruits of that. Because a lot of great people come out of these things. For example, the fall of Rome. There seems to be a hewing in our imagination between people like St. John Chrysostom, St. Hilaire of Poitiers, St. Columba, St. Benedict, St. Basil the Great. We seem to have this hewing in the mind between them and Attila the Hun. And the Battle of Chalons or the Battle of Adrianople. We have a hewing between figures like St. Augustine and the establishments of the most hardcore systematic Christian doctrines, and between what was going on contemporaneously. And usually that was very, very difficult circumstances. For example, we often don't remember that St. Francis of Assisi and St. Dominic were alive during perhaps the nastiest heresy of the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, Catharism. St. Dominic was actually preaching against it very strongly down in southern France and parts of Italy. We forget that a papal legate was murdered by the Cathars while the Dominican and Franciscan orders were being established. We forget that St. John of the Cross and St. Ignatius of Loyola and St. Teresa of Jesus, right, were alive as the Protestant Reformation was really revving up. We forget that such important writers of St. Robert Bellarmine were writing against Calvinists as they were making massive inroads into imperial Roman territory. So we can't really say that there's been a decline. In fact, I imagine right now that by virtue of just how difficult and how all-encompassing modernism is in our society, I would be very shocked if there aren't some supremely gifted saints at the same time. In fact, Hilaire Belloc, in his book The Great Heresies, when he speaks of modernism, he calls it the Antichrist. Just between us. He says it's worse than Islam. He says it's worse than Protestantism. He says it's worse than Catharism. And he says it's worse than Arianism. Of course, we have popes. I think it was Pope St. Pius IX who said that modernism is the synthesis of all heresies. And we labour under that. And so, isn't it reasonable to expect, or perhaps not in ourselves, but to remember that there aren't maybe great saints amongst us? So, I wouldn't call the Arian controversy necessarily as a decline, as much as the fiery furnace that forges the steel and the silver of human souls, as well as Christian doctrine. Because the great thing about these heretical controversies, they really make clear where the truth lies, whereas before it wasn't quite so clear. Chris Lopez asks, what is your opinion on existentialism and writers such as Camus and Paul Sartre? I think it's hopelessly inadequate. As for Camus and Paul Sartre, I haven't read them. I just know that Paul Sartre was known for his lack of charisma. Does anyone know of a Benedict option for people who have pretty much no farming skill? You buy these things pots and you start planting them in your flat. What's your opinion on existentialism as described by actual philosophers? Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. I haven't read Kierkegaard, but Nietzsche I have read. And he is the king of misdirection, right? Because he never... In fact, he explicitly says, I'm not interested in arguing in logic, right? And he just uses rhetorical power, which, being someone who was a professor of philology, particularly classical philology. In fact, his very first writing, The Birth of Charity, was specifically linked to the Greek... and to Greek tragedy and comedy, right? He could take advantage of that rhetoric incredibly well. And so just demolish things. Fortunately, his ire towards Christianity was turned on Protestantism. Now, I don't think that doesn't mean that I would say that he would have dealt well with Christianity from Catholicism or from apostolic sources. What I'm saying is that his rhetoric would have still done a very hefty blow. In fact, a priest friend of mine, a doctor with a doctorate from Oxford, described Nietzsche as the Antichrist's prophet. Let's see. Okay, continuing. Distributism seems cool, but how would you give everyone the means to produce? I basically think it's pie in the sky. I wish that we could have a system where we had a society of yeoman farmers, but it's just not going to happen. It has never happened, and it probably never will. But it's a good ideal, and it's certainly better than the current slave state that we live in, right? Because wage slavery is the thing, right? You have capitalists who will belittle the term wage slavery, but it really is, right? Because the trouble with a lot of these capitalists online, and they don't even have real introspection themselves, is that they don't realize that the majority of people aren't entrepreneurial characters. I know that I am. I'm the sort of person who can and will come up with something to sell. I mean, this YouTube channel is one example of that. But the majority of people aren't like that. Most people just want to grill. Most people just want to grill. They want to get married and have a couple of kids. They're not interested in throwing 18 hours a day into a software project. And they're certainly not interested in somebody condescending to them and telling them to pull them up by their bootstraps. In fact, that whole pull you up by the bootstraps, yeah, okay, mate, tell me how to pull my bootstraps up into a microprocessor factory. In fact, I think that this pull you up by your bootstraps mentality is an indication that we are so trapped in a service-based economy that we can't possibly conceive of large-scale production being important, right? Because we're not an artisanal... We can't do an artisanal society with things like microprocessors or televisions. You cannot have artisans crafting out Intel CPUs. It's just straight up impossible. You need a high amount of money and a high amount of resources all working together in one with hundreds of factory workers to produce microprocessors. It's just not going to happen by people just pulling their bootstraps up. Unless you are somehow supremely lucky, make literally millions of pounds through the internet, through some service, and then decide, hey, I'm going to build a microprocessor factory for no reason. There's a reason why all of this computer research started with groups like IBM, and they were funded by government. Okay, we're going to keep going for another 5 minutes, fellas. But Catharism died, and Islam and Protestantism have not. Catharism, in its real heresy, hasn't died. Because you still have a lot of people who believe that good and evil are forces that fight each other for domination of the world. In fact, we're in one of the most Gnostic times in human history. Society is awash with different cults of various kinds. And most of them take this good-evil duality to be something for granted. In fact, I was shocked when I first read St. Augustine talk about evil as a privation, because most people have been taught from a very young age that they are dual forces, and that both have existence in and of themselves. In fact, a lot of theoretical physics has some commonalities with these sorts of writings. For example, string theory. That is a very strong parallel with the Hermetic principles of Hermes Trismegistus that were written in the 2nd century AD. String theory isn't new. Now, of course, they're not identical, but you can see that, ironically enough, the rift between them when you look at the principles and compare them to modern theoretical physics. One pillar of the Lutheran Church was the Psalms, as Luther loved the Psalms. Yeah, that's a good part of Luther. The Psalms are great. And when the socialists subdued the Swedish Lutheran Church in the 1950s, the first things they did was gut the Psalm book. Bruh. Kierkegaard's leap of faith is an interesting concept, though. I don't know. Do you know President Sunday? I think it would be a good stream if you discussed Christianity with him. No. I'm shocked so many people believe in astrology. You see, it's mostly a woman thing, because men tend to go hardcore atheist. Women tend to go into this kind of new agey stuff a lot more. And it just melts society. It's very sad. These poor girls, like, I know this poor girl, right, who, largely due to the societal problems with other girls. She developed some issues, and so she started to dabble in that sort of thing to help her out with it. And it didn't have the best of results. Now, she's a lovely girl, and it's actually a miracle that enough of her has survived this kind of assault from the sorts of things she was involved with. But it is a very, very present thing. Weird question. How do you feel about D&D? I used to play it. I don't think the whole anti-D&D crusade was a good idea. I think what they should have done is perhaps a bunch of Dominican brothers produce an alternative. Because the thing with the D&D system is that it's quite easy to replicate, right? You just change the dice rolls and you change the stats. And if you had it from a more Thomistic point of view, you'd not only likely have a better game, because Gygax wasn't a metaphysician, but you'd probably have something more fun, something that you could do a lot more with. Just laughing at Iana95's comment. What's the consensus on burning incense in the house? Well, I do it. My family hates it, though. Considering how many left-wing young women there are, there probably won't be enough decent women here. George, why do you always blackpill in the chat? Trust in God! Oh no, there probably won't be enough decent women for young men to marry nowadays. Like, okay, trust in God, right? If you're meant to go into the priesthood, you're meant to go in the priesthood, right? If God wants you to get married, He'll give you a wife. Chill. Trust the plan. And lighten up. Lighten up. You need to lighten up. D&D features the occult heavily. Yeah, I know it does. That's one thing. That you see, that's why I think that they should have just produced a better alternative, because you can't just go to an average person, oh, it heavily features the occult, because they'll just laugh at you because they don't believe in it. But if you produce a better alternative, then you can just draw people away from it. Okay, so we're going to bring it to a close. Final question here. Victor Tiger Sandu asks, 1984 is a forecast for the future. No, more Brave New World, to be honest. Which is arguably a worse fate. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed the stream. I hope you found it useful. Thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you later. Goodbye.